I've been saying for years that there's something not right about this place. I mean, whether it's Tony talking about insects the size of refrigerators swarming around in the sewers, all that stuff about the Moorton werewolf, or just the urban myths like the one about the dead phone or old ragbag the scarecrow, the place is just wrong. My dad used to say the same, and God rest his soul, he's been dead for 10 years, so he didn't even know about half of this stuff. He just felt it, you know? It's why I moved away. About 8 years back, after my old man carked, it was time to get out and not look back. The problem is that Moorton doesn't like to let you go. It has a funny way of pulling you back, so that despite your best efforts and most sincere intentions, you find yourself, yet again, walking through those narrow streets and seeing the same landscapes you swore you were leaving behind. Obviously, part of it is family and friends. You can move, but if they don't, then you're still tethered, aren't you? Still joined to the place, not physically, but with the kind of bonds that you don't see. Invisible strings that keep you connected. The other tug is work. If you move away and want to stay away, then the distance has to be far enough that you can't be pulled back. Most people don't do that. They move to surrounding villages, local towns, or even nearby cities. Places that are far away, but not far enough. Take me, for example. I moved to the other side of the world. I took a job in Singapore working for the conservation agency. My job dealt directly with boreal conservation, basically. I was in charge of categorizing, planting, and ensuring the continued propagation of trees. Now, whilst you might think of Singapore as a built-up metropolis, there are still areas of rainforest there, so I was kept more than busy with the extensive varieties of plant life, and what my friends told me was tree hugging. I was happy, healthy, and as many miles from Moorton as I could be, until around 3 months ago. It was a Monday, one of only 2 days a week that I spent time in the office, dealing with admin, permits, and collating the data we had collected from the field. Waiting for me that morning was an email from the Board of Trustees of our organisation, alongside a detailed report on graft and splicing techniques for conservation purposes. For the uninitiated, which I imagine will be the majority of people reading this, splicing and grafting are two different techniques used in the conservation of rare species of trees. Grafting involves literally fastening limbs from the rare tree to other similar species so that they will eventually begin to grow from the trunk of an entirely different tree. This technique is used by farmers with fruit trees. It is surprisingly easy, for example, to take limbs from an orange, apple, or cherry tree and graft them to lemon trees so that you eventually end up with a tree that bears several different types of fruit, depending upon which branch you pick from. This technique is particularly useful with the conservation of rare species because when limbs from the rare species flower and fruit, seeds can then be collected and distributed close by to grow new individual specimens of that species, which will then fruit and flower. Splicing is exactly what it sounds like and is a bit more space age than the rather ancient technique of grafting. Essentially, genetic material from one species is mixed or implanted into another in order to give the rarer species qualities that might help them flourish. So for example, if you have a rare tree type that is not very hardy and will die if there are large fluctuations in temperature or mixture, you can splice it with a far hardier species so that the original becomes reinforced and has a greater chance of survival. This is basically a high-tech version of cross-pollination and controlled breeding that farmers have been doing with grain crops for centuries. And implausibly enough, it was this technique, along with ideas about grafting, that would eventually lead me back to Moorton. The email I received outlined how 6 of the critically endangered species we had growing in one area of the national park could be rescued if they were spliced and grafted with a rare species of British oak tree that had particular qualities enabling it to thrive in soil conditions similar to those that we had in the affected area. This oak species was also apparently very hardy and would enable our 6 struggling species much better chances of survival. The catch was that the oak variety itself was rare, and whilst there were several very similar species all over the British Isles, it was that particular variety that was requested for this particular splicing study. I'm sure you can guess already where one of the only known examples was growing. For my superiors, this seemed like the most marvellous stroke of luck and coincidence. What were the chances that the exact species they needed would have its only well-known example growing not a mile from where I was born and raised? Quite the coincidence indeed, I thought, as I felt those invisible strings I had thought long severed once again reaching up to claim me. For my bosses, It was a marvelous story and opportunity. They could fund a trip for me back to my hometown and have me collect samples not only from a species that would help save the 6 in Singapore, but also from an individual tree that I not only knew well, but knew by name. Grendel's oak, named for some unknown reason after the monster in the Old English Beowulf epic, had stood in Moorton for what some said was over 400 years. Whether that date was accurate, I don't know, but certainly there were photographs showing the tree dating back almost a century, and illustrations that stretched back even further. Yet one more of the many whispered horrors that circulated in Moorton spoke of how Grendel's oak was the burial place of some fiend or creature. Some said it was the resting place of the old witch mother Eastrom, others that it was some kind of creature, and still others that such stories were utter pish and nonsense. Whatever the truth, it was certainly the case that we were warned as kids not to get too close to the tree itself. Exactly why was never explained. I often assumed that the reason had been lost somehow, that parents would stop their children from getting close because their parents had stopped them, a habit passed down through generations even though the original reason was long ago faded into obscurity. Still, it was a notion that persisted. One look at the oak told you how seriously this idea was taken. Whilst every other inch of Meadow Park was kept in neat and tidy order, with flower beds filled, hedges pruned and lawns meticulously mowed, for a stretch of around 3 meters around the old oak, the grass had remained untouched and uncut for almost a decade. The blades themselves, strangling out the few persistent daffodils that tried in vain to emerge, was over thigh height, whilst other weeds were cramped and squeezed into the area by the base of the tree. Even the gardener on his sight-down lawnmower would not venture close enough to that tree to have any effect. Yet now, despite having made every effort to be as far away from this place as possible, I was going to be the one venturing up to not only touch it, but take from it. The process of extracting the samples involved digging down, close to the edge of where the circular fringe of overgrown grass, and cutting away samples from the roots. It should have been a simple case of turning up and doing it, but unfortunately, the powers that be in Moorton were more than a little wary of public opinion. I was granted permission to dig and to do the extractions, but not during the day. People might be disturbed to see me so close to the tree, they said, have to respect local tradition, don't want to disrupt others using the park for recreation. There was little or no concern for how approaching the fabled tree under the cover of darkness might affect me, but then I guess that's typical. So, at around 11 p.m, with the gates to the park specially unlocked to allow me access and not a single soul around, I began my work. I'll admit without any hesitation that I was more than a little creeped out by the whole thing. Whilst it might sound strange to say that someone who works their whole life with trees might be made uncomfortable by one, that did not take into account what an ugly-looking thing the tree was in the first place, nor the years of social conditioning I had endured. I had been told, almost since I was old enough to understand, that there was something wrong with this tree. As it turned out, those who had told me these things were correct. I approached the tree in silence. There was not the faintest breath of wind that night, and the stillness made it seem as if the whole world had been put on pause. It also made the task before me feel like a very lonely one. Around me, well-trimmed lawns, stone walls, and neatly kept flower beds stretched away in silence, the grass looking almost blue in the tinted half-light of the moon. I began to dig, conscious as I did not only of how loud my every movement seemed, but of how my own breath seemed to echo and fill the empty space. Sure enough, my breathing was quickened, my heart racing. Though I would have been embarrassed to tell any of my colleagues why, there was no denying the fact. I was scared. Kneeling down on all fours and hacking away at the ground, I at first thought that perhaps the job would be simple. I would cut several patches, and once I reached the roots, I would sever a piece and take it away. But that's not what happened. Having dug down several feet, I hit my first large root. Pouring water onto it to clean it slightly, I took my instrument and attempted to make an extraction. That's when the root moved. At first, I thought I was mistaken. That some trick of the light and reflection had suggested movement where there was none. But I was wrong. The root was moving. It slithered and squirmed like some gigantic worm as thick around as a man's forearm. In seconds, The piece I had initially uncovered, a gnarled and roughly textured limb, had disappeared into the soil, the section now at the surface. Like the back of a great writhing snake was jet black and supple, slick and reflective. As if full with moisture, it coiled and writhed through the upturned soil, searching blindly and moving ever downward. I withdrew my blade and watched in amazement as in other parts of the uncut section the surface of the ground began to rupture and break as slender black tubes swam and undulated through the cracked ground. I had never seen anything like it. I pulled away and, after briefly taking some film on my phone camera, abandoned the entire project, packing up my stuff and moving as far away as possible. I sent my video to my superiors and explained that I would not be returning to the tree or to Moorton. Their response was short and succinct. "Thank you for sharing this information. We will send you a new assignment in due course." Around a month later, I got a call from my sister, who still lives in a town adjacent to Moorton. She told me how parts of the old Grendel tree had been dug up, but that there were now tents set up all around it, as well as me in hazmat suits and police officers. It seems that my superiors sent one of my colleagues to continue an investigation into the tree and its roots. Digging down further than I had dared, he had uncovered more than just the snake-like roots. He had found bones. Dogs, cats, squirrels, and even foxes, dozens upon dozens of animal skeletons, and in every case, there were winding threads of roots wrapped around and through the bones. "It was as if," she said, "the roots had wrapped around the things before they were dead and dragged them into the soil. You know, like a Venus flytrap or something. As if the tree caught passing animals and pulled them under, then fed on them slowly, sucking out the nutrients." That idea was bad enough, but a week later I received a second phone call. One that oddly I almost knew was coming. Again, it was my sister. This time she told me that they had found more than animal bones around the tree. There was, she said, a child's bike, the entire thing under the soil with those horrible black roots wrapped all around it, like tentacles of an octopus. As she said this, we both knew, as everyone in Moorton knew, it would not be long until human remains were found. A child who had wandered too close, perhaps riding on his way home one night at dusk, unaware that black roots were squirming out from beneath his feet to ensnare, entrap and devour him. That news never came. In fact, the entire thing was hushed up and forgotten about. A large metal fence was erected around the tree, allegedly to preserve and protect it. But no mention was ever made of what else might have been found within the tangle of its roots. Why? The answer is simple. It's not only trees with dark black roots that are greedy. A quick look at the accounts of my organization that year, accounts that are publicly available for view, shows a payment of $250,000 to the Moorton Borough Council and Moorton Conservation Trust. This was not only hush money, but a payment to ensure that the samples taken from that tree were shipped without delay to Singapore so that they could be spliced or grafted with the local species to preserve them. I will tell you now that in the next few months, I plan to move back to Moorton. Whilst that town has always terrified me and still does, it does not scare me as much as the thought of what might happen when material from the roots of that tree is mixed with species that grow all over the rainforest. I'm sure that it will help keep some species alive, but I worry that what we produce in the process might be something we'd much rather have died.